So first of all, welcome to this inaugural online briefing from Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. For those that don't know us, and I think you all do, I'm Nicholas Wood. I'm a former journalist with the New York Times and BBC, and 10 years ago, I set up the world's only travel company dedicated to current affairs. We also have a sister company called Beyond the Headlines, and it's under their banner that we're organizing a series of briefings from our experts around the globe, with the aim of giving you access to top expertise from your homes as the coronavirus unfolds. This first talk looks at the United States and is entitled From 1918 to 2020, the US response to the flu pandemic. It now seems pretty clear that the US is set to become one of the hardest hit countries by the coronavirus, despite the advance warning it has had from China and Europe. Similarly, 102 years ago, the US was hit by a similar crisis. While the world has obviously changed enormously, not least in terms of medicine and technology, we're interested to know what parallels exist here. And our focus here is on how the government has reacted at both state and federal levels. We'll be joined here by three experts. As I say, we're still trying to get Jeff Smith online, but the experts are from California, Nancy Bristow. Nancy is a professor of history at Puget Sound University and the author of The American Pandemic, The Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Epidemic. In Washington, we have Jeffrey Smith, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, formerly with the Washington Post, and now a national security editor, or the national security editor at the Center for Public Integrity. Jeff will be looking at the divisions between state and federal governments, and I hope we manage to get him online shortly. He is having some technical difficulties. And then we'll also be speaking to Dave Swenson, who's a professor of economics at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. Dave was also our expert on our recent study tour that we did during the primaries, and we had a fascinating time with him looking at rural communities in sort of western Iowa. So our aim is to allot roughly 10 minutes to each speaker, and then I hope we'll have some time for some Q&A afterwards. Just to start with, I want to turn to Nancy. Our aim here is to look at the 1918-19 epidemic and draw some comparisons here. Woodrow Wilson's administration initially played down the flu crisis, apparently worried that it would distract from the war effort. And I am no expert on this at all, and that's why we've got you here. But it seems to me that different states had very varying policies on how to tackle the epidemic. And I'd very much like you to just give us an overview of that and how the United States overall reacted at both the federal and state level. Nancy.
Well, you're absolutely right. There's tremendous variation across the country. The federal level is a very interesting situation. The United States, of course, is at war. We're late in the war. So Woodrow Wilson is, in fact, very preoccupied with maintaining the war effort and deeply concerned, apparently, that any attention to the influenza pandemic would distract Americans from the very important business of finishing the work in Europe. As a result, the President of the United States does not address publicly this international pandemic a single time. He literally remains closed-mouthed and does not reference an illness that will in fact kill 675,000 Americans. He will allow that to pass unspoken from his office.
Thank you.
Which is, of course, quite remarkable. Instead, the effort to fight the pandemic in the United States will be led by the public health people and by the Red Cross, and primarily at the state and local level. The most important thing to be done from the eyes of the United States Public Health Service is public education. This is a world in which people are still using common drinking cups in offices and schools, on public transportation. Spitting publicly is still permitted. So there's a lot of work to be done just teaching Americans some basic public hygiene. And that effort is in some ways led by the federal government. The United States Public Health Service with the assistance of the American Public Health Association and the Red Cross, do an extraordinary job of spreading awareness about some basic hygienic practices that for some Americans were actually new things to learn. The Red Cross also did really essential work at the national level, moving nurses around to try to make sure that communities that were hardest hit had the assistance coming from outside, similar to what we're seeing right now. But most of the work that was done to handle the pandemic was taken care of at the state, county, and local levels. That's where public health was best organized and was most robust, but the variation is extraordinary. So you could have a community like Milwaukee that, because of the progressive era, that time of great reform activism in the United States and the growth of an awareness that government could play a meaningful role in Americans' lives, that had been ongoing before the war. So a community like Milwaukee is prepared to act even before things have gotten serious. In late September, there will be a case at a local naval base, and they will immediately quarantine that base and no longer allow those sailors to visit town. They'll initiate the closing of public spaces. They will call for the isolation of those who are sick. They will do this early. They will maintain these practices for the duration. When a third wave comes to Milwaukee, they'll be able to reassert some of those controls and the public will cooperate. And as a result, Milwaukee will have a very low death rate relative to some other cities. Alternatively, the city that always takes the hit, and I'm afraid I'll do the same thing, Philadelphia, moves very slowly to act. There's a fair amount of political corruption in the city. We know that Boston has been under siege already for close to a month by the time it really is an issue for Philadelphia. But in late September, though it's clear that this is coming, it's clear that this is a pandemic because it's hitting other countries. This is a global phenomenon by then. And yet they go ahead in the last week of September with holding the 4th Liberty Loan Drive opening parade and invite thousands of citizens to congregate in celebration of the need to raise money for this last push in the war. 3 days later, the city reports 635 new cases of influenza. So in places where there was a robust, pre-existing public health system that was well trusted by the citizenry, you might have very good, very quick, immediate responses, very thorough responses. And in other communities, you might have the city itself leading efforts that in fact undercut the health of the citizenry.
So Nancy, is it possible to talk, because we've got a quite an international audience, and many of us, and me included, won't be fully sort of conversant or fully understand the responsibilities between the federal and state level. And could you talk about whether there was any conflict at all? I mean, you said the President, Woodrow Wilson, didn't mention the flu epidemic once, but what kind of support could have been available at the federal level, and what kind of cooperation was there?
Yeah, well, that's what's so interesting is that at this historical moment, the power of the American federal government is just growing. World War I is a moment in which the federal government gains a kind of power and engagement with the citizenry that was really unheard of in the United States previously. This is a moment at which, for the first time, there's the beginnings of rumblings of the idea of a social safety net, of an awareness that we need federal income tax. And so the draft is, in a sense, the fullest incursion into the individual citizen's life that had been seen really since the Civil War. So Americans weren't necessarily expecting the federal government to play a major role in this. They were much more expecting it would be the government that they're familiar with, the government in their town or city, or the government of their state that traditionally had played the largest role in their lives and would do so in this case as well. So the conflicts that we see going on in terms of lines of authority are primarily between local and state governments. And the federal government really sitting off to the side with the pandemic, not playing a major role. The federal public health system does not have authority to wield at the local or state level. So there are conflicts indeed in the state of New Jersey, which right now, of course, is again under siege. In 1918, in New Jersey, one of the main cities, Newark, a big city today as well, is very resistant to the state law. So the governor of the state is passing ordinances suggesting that you must close public businesses, and the mayor of Newark doesn't want to do so. He drags his feet, he does it begrudgingly, and it's several days distant between when a law comes down at the state level and it's actually enacted in his city. And again, Newark is a city that will suffer very desperately during the pandemic. And eventually the mayor will be at war with his own police force. In fact, we're trying to implement the state law, even as the mayor is sort of wanting to push it to the side to preserve the economy. Again, a stress that we're seeing right now in the United States, arguments about economic well-being versus literal medical, physical health. But it's an interesting moment because it is not a conflict with the federal government that we see at this time. It simply doesn't have that role to play. It doesn't have that kind of authority in the United States.
So, and what is the economic impact? I mean, the epidemic took place over a year and a half, with 2 peak periods and then a smaller surge later on. How did did businesses try and continue? I mean, what and you talked about the sort of sporadic nature of different approaches in different states. So what actually happened to the economy over that period?
It's a very interesting question, and there's some new research that came out literally over the weekend. Some economists have been doing some research looking at the data from 1918, and it appears in their preliminary study that those communities that had the most robust public health responses, in other words, that closed early, had very comprehensive closures, maintained them for the duration, that those communities actually fare better in the aftermath economically as well. That in fact, good public health practices not only saved.
I saw that research. One thing that I questioned about it was that the virus affected a much younger strata of society than the current one. And so it affected people who are far more productive. So I wondered whether the comparison there was a good one.
Yeah, and that I can't know for certain, and yet it might actually argue even more fully for that, which is to say, here was a pandemic that was injuring those who are our most productive citizens. So keeping things closed longer meant that the economic hit in the short term would have been much deeper, right? And yet they do recover very well. I don't know for sure how we'd work with that comparison. Again, I'm not going to pretend to be an economist, and historians don't like to predict the future by any means. So I will step away from suggesting what we know for certain about 2020. I do think it's a really important finding that to prevent illness and death in your community serves you well in the long haul, seems like the takeaway lesson. That there isn't actually a conflict between economic well-being and good health in your community.
Got it. And I'm going to turn to Dave Swenson now, just straight away to talk about the economic parallels. Dave, can you just give us an update? We're obviously only a few weeks into this in terms of the lockdown. What impact, what data has come through so far about the US economy?
Sure. We just had new numbers out from the Department of Labor here in the United States. New filings for unemployment insurance claims were up 6.65 million. You pair that with last week's filings, and we have over 10 million new uninsurance claims in the United States in just a scant 2 weeks. In my own state here in Iowa, just as to be emblematic of it, in 2 weeks we've grown by 100,000 claims. Over the course of the Great Recession, unemployment only increased by 47,000 people. So our new claims are more than double the level of annualized unemployment that we had during the Great Recession. So the acuteness of this right now is stark. And if you think about If you think about this in terms of, there's a variety of contexts. We have what happened in China, and we had an economy that was in distress and a country that literally took a province and closed it down completely. We don't have that here in the United States. It's different here in the United States. What we're doing is incremental steps. And so our economic impacts are going to accumulate, or they're going to mount over time. Right now, where our economy is being affected, of course, is in dining and drinking and hospitality, places where you and I like to congregate and get together after work. Those types of places, because they're high transmittability. We know tourism has been hammered, and other kinds of leisure activities, those have been hit. And again, they're places where people congregate closely together, and or because they congregate closely together are just simply prone to touch things and to infect themselves. That's number one. That happened immediately. That's explaining most of what's happened with regard to this unemployment insurance spike. Also losses in retail activities, non-essential retail activities. Now, it's somewhat variable across the states. I live in a state that isn't asking people to shelter in place, to stay at home. It's asking us just simply to social distance. The effect in a city like New York or other places that in San Francisco really have locked down tightly, that economic impact is going to spread out much more widely into the service sector, into the retail sector, and then otherwise affect other kinds of activities. So what we have is somewhat of a rolling, again, incremental crisis, and it's going to be realized. It's also again significantly geographically variable.
I'm going to come back to Nancy in just a second to ask about the long-term impact of the epidemic in 1918, 1919. But before that, Dave, you outlined how Iowa at the moment hasn't implemented any stringent measures yet. That's in stark contrast to places like Ohio, where Governor DeWine implemented very early measures, quite stringent measures, very, very early on. Dave, are you able to give us just a bit of an overview of how the different states have approached this? I know this isn't something you've been studying, but just anecdotally, what have you seen?
Well, both anecdotally and practically, what's going on is the variable response to impressions of the severity. If you think you can think in terms of Ohio, or you can think in terms of, let's say, what's going on right now in Detroit, and where Michigan is very stridently seeking both controls within their state as well as federal assistance. Out here in Iowa, we're very, very sensitive to interfering with the economy in any way, shape, or form. And so preemptively interfering or quelling economic activity is something that just politically isn't popular. Now, there are calls from several cities where there are hotspots. Iowa City, Johnson County has a lot of cases. The county just to the north has a significant outbreak in a rest home. Polk County, Des Moines, the central part of the state, those numbers are growing relatively rapidly. Those local leaders are calling on the state leader to implement more stringent measures. Thus far, as of last night, she's resisted. She said the words, "We want to keep Iowa open for business."
And Iowa, just to remind everybody, Iowa has a Republican governor, and the majority of state positions are Republican held, are they?
That is true. It's completely Republican controlled, House, Senate, and governor.
Okay. Going back to you, Nancy, you talked about the benefits of having early restrictions and how those cities recovered first. But Nancy, can you just talk a bit more about the economic fallout and the long term? You've been particularly strong at looking at the sort of social impact as well. So maybe you could talk a bit about both those aspects.
It's a difficult question to answer in some ways. Because there was not a lot of attention paid to the pandemic and its aftermath. The country was so preoccupied by the war that sort of an awareness of the particular disparate impacts of the war and of demobilization alongside the pandemic, those two have not been uncoupled. And so it's very difficult to say whether that post-war recession is in part the impact of the pandemic, or is it primarily about demobilization from the war? And as far as I am aware, those two have not been pulled apart and looked at independent of one another. It's difficult to tell then the extent to which the post-pandemic economy was influenced by the pandemic itself, or also this demobilization phase in the aftermath of the war. The country certainly does suffer a recession briefly, but then as is well known, I think, the United States economy flourishes in the early part of the 1920s. So in the aftermath of the pandemic, the United States is absolutely, as Dave said, open for business. Not all businesses will be flourishing, and we know that the United States, like the world, will enter the Great Depression 10 years later. But in the immediate aftermath, a short recession, and then a booming economy in the early 1920s for the United States.
Right. So Dave, that brings us back to you, really. In terms of the intervention we're seeing, it's unprecedented. I mean, the idea of direct payments to households, this is economic theory that has really not been implemented in a wide way. So I'm interested to see what impact that is having. But Dave, just to come back to you on that point, unprecedented intervention, what impact is it having? And how do you see this playing out on different communities? Which communities are being most affected by this? What kinds of people are being affected by this?
Yeah, the new legislation, it's called the CARES legislation, and I can't remember what it stands for, but that's okay. It's $2 trillion or more. We probably will see other rounds of assistance as we go through. And just to use the word $2 trillion in support of both the economy and society in a historically recalcitrant Senate and an unwillingness to engage in this kind of transfers is really, really interesting to watch out. I can break it down for you. $560 billion of that is going to go to individuals. It's going to be $1,200 per person, another $500 per dependent child, and it's an income related. People who make over $100,000 or individuals aren't going to get any money, but we're going to get a lot of money that way. Most of the money that's coming is also extending unemployment benefits and adding an extra $600 a week to unemployment benefits, so that basically if you end up being unemployed, you're not necessarily worse off as a consequence, because unemployment benefits are a fraction of your normal earnings. Another $500 billion for large corporations. Most of that is just simply to provide a loan-based backstop to maintain their operation, to not allow any of them to get into such difficulty that they end up having to slide towards bankruptcy. Again, another $377 billion for small business. A lot of small businesses, they can't, simple things like making rent, maintaining their payroll. So there's assistance to try to help that as well. So, $340 billion for state and local governments. When the economy collapses, when the economy slows down, state and local governments, who primarily must balance their budgets, will find that their revenues come in less than they thought they were going to, especially because they depend on sales, use, and local income or individual income taxes. Those receipts are going to go down, so money is going to come into state and local governments to help fill that hole. And that happened during the Great Recession as well. Quite a lot of money came in to maintain state and local government services over a 3-year period because of the weakening of the state and local government's revenue structures as a result.
When you say the Great Recession, so I'm not familiar with that term. Do you mean the financial crisis 2008, that period then, or are you talking about much earlier?
No, I was talking about during 2008. I'm sorry. Yep, I'm sorry. Public, just a mere $154 billion, but that's still a lot of money. Again, how that money is going to be allocated, most of that money is being dedicated to hospitals. So we're going to try to maintain the integrity of our hospitals. One of the things to point out with regard to the economics of all of this is that the healthcare industry is actually laying off people right now, because you and I aren't going to clinics, so they're not having elective surgeries. And a lot of things, we've shifted a lot of our healthcare activity towards maintaining this crisis, and a large fraction of our healthcare staffing in the United States isn't geared towards being able to help. So public health is one of the areas, education, and then other safety net, expanded safety net activity. So that's how we're going to respond. How is that going to play out? Well, the first thing it did is it helped to stabilize the markets. And even though the markets are going up and down, it did help to stabilize the markets. Plus, we've had a tremendous injection of cash or liquidity by the Federal Reserve to just make sure that there is adequate amounts of money available at low enough interest rates for firms to be able to tap into, again, to be able to maintain their solvency. So the first thing that's happened is some stability in the markets. To the degree to which that's going to last, well, it remains to be seen. What we're interested in is how much stability are we going to realize in the overall economy? Well, first off, we in the United States, 70% of our economy is buying stuff. My income is based on you buying stuff from me. Your income is based on me buying stuff from you. Those kinds of transactions, we've stopped doing that. We're not buying cars. We're not buying washing machines. We're not going out to eat, which we love to do in the United States. We're not doing a lot of things transactionally that we used to do. And so that part of the economy has slowed down. This is going to help some of that, but a lot of it, so long as we're in some kind of quarantine status, we're not going to reopen restaurants. We're not going to reopen leisure activities. We're not going to reopen a lot of things. So that part is going to be a lasting part of the consequences. Now, whether the safety net will carry those firms through far enough or not is questionable. Small businesses have high failure rates. This is going to aggravate that. There's no way around it. We're going to lose a lot of small businesses as a consequence of this. We can whistle past the graveyard, but that's not going to happen. We're going to lose a lot of small businesses. We may also lose a lot of established businesses that had an over-dependence on certain categories as well. So that's going to happen. Larger corporations, we'll have to wait and see. Manufacturing, again, it's consumption. And now we have it's a global pandemic, and we're going to have a global recession. We're going to have a global contraction of manufactured goods demand. And that's what we're looking forward to in wave 2 economically. Not wave 2 pandemically, but wave 2 economically. So that's what we're looking at right now. And then over the course of 2 quarters, 3 quarters, can we recover much or some of that back such that we end up with something of a U-shape to this outbreak economically, and we are able to claw our way back to a healthy world economy, but also a healthy national economy. The advantage we had, Nick, is that we went into this pandemic with a healthy economy. It was structurally sound across the board. We didn't have a housing bubble. We didn't have an energy bubble. We didn't have some sort of inflationary bubble driving things askew. We had a healthy economy, and then it had a catastrophe. So the expectation is that we have mostly a healthy undergirding to maintaining economic activity as we work our way through this.
I think that's fascinating, that last comment. My instinct is that I think the United States is slightly behind the curve. If you look at the shutdowns that have taken place in Europe, they've been far more complete. And you mentioned it, for small companies, turnover is king. It's absolutely necessary. And if you don't have the cash coming in, it's very hard to survive, 2 weeks to the end, until you have to pay out the next paychecks to your employees. And if the cash is not there immediately and you're reluctant to get into debt, it's very hard to see how those small companies are going to survive. And I would certainly, from a UK perspective, there are many companies going bust now. Day by day that's happening. We've got some very good questions coming in for both of you. So I've got Laura Hamilton, who's got a question here for Nancy. I understand there's a state governors forum now, she says. Was there some kind of forum back in 1918? And for both of you, Dave as well, what, if any, influence does it have now in 2020? If it existed in 1918, did it have any have any influence? Was there some kind of forum from governors there?
Not that I'm aware of. Certainly there was an extraordinary amount of information sharing. without any set infrastructure. That the United States Public Health Service did a great deal of work coordinating information among the states, sharing information. Certainly there was communication among mayors, among governors, but that we just didn't have the same kind of governmental infrastructure as firmly in place in 1918. I think that's a dramatically important difference, that we have capacities now that we simply didn't have then. Not only medical capacities, but I think also informational capacities and organizational capacities. Have we underutilized them? I would argue absolutely. Are we behind the curve, as you suggested? Absolutely. Are there possibilities, though, because of what we have? I think absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So
well, let me add real quick here. And my own reading of history, both in terms of politics and the evolution of social programs, during this time period that Nancy's talking about, cities and states were the laboratories for reform, for both public health movements, for whole wide categories of welfare reform, from child health to animal health, to all manner of, and to public sanitation. And so the federal government, to a degree, just didn't have any authority. Well, now what we have in the United States right now is the federal government has a tremendous amount of authority, but it has been ham-handed in terms of enacting that authority and enacting that authority in a level way. And what we're seeing right now is both initiative and independence of action among the various states and the cities. And so again, we're back into this place where the cities and the states are becoming the laboratories for reform and or action. And in this case, the federal government truly is trying to play catch up.
So what powers does the federal government actually have? That's a question that's been put by somebody here. I think it's a really, a key question here. Or is it just a threat of withdrawing federal funds?
Well, the power of the purse, of course, or the power of the purse. The power of federal assistance is one thing. That's the type of thing that needs to be, again, evenly distributed. The federal government can't tell states what to do except under extraordinary circumstances. The federal government can't, for example, as far as I understand, it can't quarantine a set of states like perhaps Trump mentioned. They were going to try to do something like that a few days ago. That's really the power of both local and state government, not the federal government. The federal government's power is to set standards, perhaps for care, but also for the allocation of resources, to provide expert guidance in the absence of that kind of guidance being in other places, and to provide personnel and or other kinds of resources to fill gaps in state and local and private sector deficiencies.
And I think that's actually, can I just add, that's one of the things that we haven't gotten right yet, which is there is a great deal of, for instance, scientific resources at the federal level, but there was no planning for it, no preparation for coordination of them. And so I think there are resources that are in a sense not being used as effectively because we have not prepared well. We have not taken emergency preparedness seriously in this country. I would argue, especially since 9/11, we've withdrawn so much funding from the kinds of agencies like our Federal Emergency Management Administration, FEMA, for instance. So I think my hope is that this is, in fact, as Dave said, a laboratory for thinking about the future, because I think we're learning a lot about what works and what doesn't work because we have such a sort of mishmash of approaches to this across what is a fairly large country with a lot of people and in different communities, right? Dave is not under a stay-at-home order. I've been under one for a couple of weeks already, and in fact, it's probably saving quite a few lives in Washington. So the role of the federal government continues to be a really interesting phenomenon, I think, in the United States compared to most European countries.
So I think that plays in nicely to how this might play out politically. This is, after all, an election year. Trump was doing very well in the polls. His poll numbers have been good among Republicans. But do we have to take into account that COVID-19 skews to older male people? Also, maybe you could argue this on both Republican and the Democratic side. There are many of Trump supporters who don't necessarily have good health care or access to good healthcare. How might this play out in terms of his base, in terms of white working class people who perhaps might have been Democrat, who now vote Republican, the kind of people we saw in downtown Des Moines who turned out in their thousands to see the president? And, you know, really, it was like a combination of a get-rich-quick rally and an evangelical service. I mean, that he could do no wrong. How's this going to play out?
Boy, that remains to be seen. You're right. We have two things going on. The primary impacts right now in terms of people being directly affected, they tend to be concentrated in urban areas. That's where most economic activity is taking place, and that's where most economic activity is being shut down right now. Urban areas lean more Democrat than they do right. We also know that rural areas are slower by virtue of slower transmittal in terms of responding to this, but same thing might be with rural states and or red states. I have seen the statistics. I saw something in the New York Times today that about how the different states are responding, and there's a significant difference between redder states versus bluer states in terms of how they're responding. That's a function of urbanization as well and the distribution of this disease, but it's also a function, I think, also of the politics of this. The information that people are receiving, depends on where you go to get your information. If you were getting your information from one source, you may have been seeing that this disease really wasn't thought of as a great big deal. It was more like the flu, and we're going to get through this no problem. Or you're getting your information from other sources, and it was something that maybe mobilized you more rapidly. Our collective cognitive, our ability to internalize risk and then translate it into personal behavior and the consequences for it varies quite a bit. What we do know is that the president got a little bitty bump in his approval ratings, which is one of the things that always happens around a crisis. We do get a bump in approval ratings. When 9/11 happened, George Bush, who really wasn't that well thought of, there was a lot of buyer's remorse after he was elected. His favorability shot to the moon, and they stayed high for a little while, but they came down and they came down and they came down, and by the time he ended out, they were very, very low. They're temporary, and we know that it takes, in terms of psychology and stimulus response, things like this where we have a strong reaction, that it fades over time. Now, how is that going to translate into political awareness, political decision-making within the context of people's attitudes and preferences remains to be seen. But the objective facts are relatively clear. This administration led by this president has struggled to provide effective leadership. And most people, if they're capable of analyzing things rationally, will have that as part of their decision criteria come November.
Okay, we've got to wrap up in about 6 minutes time, so we've got time for a few more questions. I wanted to follow that up, Nancy, to ask you about what was the political cost of seeing bodies stacked up like cardboard. You see that referred to again and again in the 1918-1919 epidemic. And I suspect we are going to see a lot more of that coming in. I've got a call coming in from maybe from Washington. And
Jeff is trying to call.
Yeah, and I might have Jeff here online. So hang on a second.
I'm here. Yes.
Jeff,
Hi.
how are you? Right. Well,
I'm
going to turn straight to Jeff. Actually, if you can hear me, I can hear you, Jeff. I'm
I
sorry
can.
you've had so much technical difficulties getting through, but you're here now, so that's great news. Jeff, you were going to start off by giving us an overview of some of the states, the different approach from different governors to how they've tackled the crisis.
Sure. So the irony here is that, well, let me start by saying that, as your listeners probably know, President Trump until recently discouraged people from taking this very seriously and didn't seem to be taking it seriously himself. That message in turn was broadcast through the television network that's basically very close to him. that has an interactive loop with him, that feeds him information and he feeds them information. It's a small, tight conversation between him and Fox News. That's basically how our country is being governed at the moment. So what happens is that Fox has. Oops, hang on.
Don't worry.
Sorry. Fox has broadcast, disregard for the last 2 months about this. And that's meant that people who watch Fox.
We're all working from home here.
Yeah, sorry. People who watch Fox have the same level of disregard. And so there's polls have shown a sharp partisan divide on whether the people believe that this poses a great risk to the U.S. healthcare system, or whether that risk poses a great risk to the United States, or whether it's a larger risk to the economy. There was a chart in the newspaper the other day that showed all the Democratic states as having much more anxiety about this outbreak on a state-by-state level, and all the Republican states having much less. And yesterday I noticed that roughly 8 in 10, or 79% of those whose main source of news is Fox, says the media has been slightly or greatly exaggerating the risk of the pandemic, with only about 15% saying they got the risks about right. That stands in sharp contrast to the networks, which are watched more typically by Democrats or by independents, MSNBC and CNN, most of whom felt that the media had been correctly portraying what's happening. And in a Grinnell College national poll conducted during the last 3 days of March, 55% of Republicans said the economic fallout is the greater risk to the United States, while only 39% said the risk of overwhelming hospitals and healthcare system was the larger concern. And in contrast, 69% of Democrats, it was a flip. They said that overwhelming the healthcare system posed the greatest risk. So the irony here is that the coronavirus fatalities are likely to be in large part a Southern and therefore a Republican problem, a problem in states where Fox News is the predominant media and Trump voters are the predominant core of the electorate. The South, this is especially difficult because the South has higher rates of uninsured, since many Republican governors rebuffed federal funding during the Obama administration for an expansion of Medicaid, a federal program that provides health insurance for the poor. The South also has higher rates of obesity and many of the diseases that make one particularly vulnerable to dying of coronavirus, including smoking, diabetes, and heart ailments. A study by an insurance-associated group recently listed 10 southern states as the least healthy overall, including Georgia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, South Carolina, West Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. These are all Trump states. So the governors in the southern states have largely followed the Fox News Trump line and done little. Whereas there's one outlier, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, a Republican. He shut down some planned high attendance public events even before his state had a single known virus case. And Ohio, as a result, has a lower an infection rate which is increasing at a much slower pace than it is in the other southern states. At the other end of this Republican spectrum was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who evidently listened to the White House and to the Fox News instead of the state's top medical experts. He waited until this week to impose a statewide stay-at-home order after photos of beaches crowded with spring vacationers outraged people elsewhere in the nation. And it's noteworthy that he's decided to exempt churches from the ban on public gatherings, so his order will have limited impact. Someone on my tweet stream noted that Pakistan and Florida are alike in this regard. They've both exempted religious observances from a ban on public gatherings. Florida is now ranked 5th in the nation for having the most new virus cases in the last 3 weeks. Florida has the highest number of people over 65 in the United States. And another governor, Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt, a Republican who's been slow to implement statewide measures, as recently as last Saturday, tweeted and then deleted a photograph of himself and his family eating at a crowded restaurant on Saturday night. Louisiana, another Republican state where they waited until after the springtime Mardi Gras holiday celebration, now has the 9th highest number of new cases in the past 3 weeks. So I saw a chart last night that listed COVID deaths by county on a per capita basis, and at the top of the list, occupying the first 2 spots with the highest number of per capita deaths in the country, were 2 Louisiana counties, including the one that New Orleans is part of. The next 2 were Georgia. The 2 after that were other additional counties in Louisiana, and there were more in the top 20 from Georgia and Louisiana. Today, the New York Times ran a chart showing where people have been traveling the most up until Friday, and the 9 southern states are at the top of the list. So clearly, I mean, the irony here is that Trump's attitude of disregard towards this is going to mostly punish his own constituency.
Right. Jeff, I'm going to extend this. We were planning to end at quarter of, but I think we'll go up to the hour. That gives us about 13 minutes to come back to you. Just briefly, I thought we'd get some reaction to what you were just saying there. Nancy, in my mind, the question is, was there a political cost to bodies piling up like cardboard in 1918?
In 1918, Americans didn't have the same expectations of their government, that their health would be in some ways protected by their government. So I think there was a great deal of sadness and mourning, perhaps some frustrations, but by and large, they were still so completely in this individualistic understanding of how life works. In a sense, I think it's the philosophy that we continue to wrestle with in the United States, which is, to what extent are we responsible to one another, and to what extent is the government really responsible for providing those safety nets? In 1918, the expectations were significantly lower, with significant costs, not only the bodies, but also, I think, those economic consequences of homelessness and being cold, not having enough food to eat. There was a great deal of suffering in addition, I think, to the deaths. You would think that might have motivated additional reforms, both the building up of the public health system and turning to a larger federal presence. We don't see that. And in fact, no, if there is a political consequence, it's counterintuitive, because we will be electing in the United States then 2 presidents, Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge, both of whom, right, have very little interest in governing or in having a federal presence in Americans' lives.
I must say I'm very interested by the comment that you wrote saying that Americans wanted to believe that influenza was actually something brought on by Germany as part of the war. Even Bayer, a German company, BayerAspirin, was suspect. I do have a question here from my good friend Stuart, who says, does anyone think this virus is a bioweapon? So Jeff or Dave, Jeff, give me a reaction to that. What's your...
So there, I would say that this is something I've been looking into a bit, because there is this coincidence between the place where this virus appears to have originated, Wuhan, and the existence there of a high security viral research facility there, which was actually constructed in China with cooperation and assistance from the French, who know how to do this. It's the only one in China so far. It's the first of 5 that China is planning to build. And they were conducting research there on coronaviruses. There are some people here, this coincidence has caused some people here to allege that, but no one in the government has said this publicly, I should say. These are private individuals making this allegation that it may have been a leak from the laboratory. But that does not mean that it was a bioweapon or developed as a bioweapon or being developed as a bioweapon at the laboratory. The laboratory quite legitimately was looking at coronaviruses and the risks they pose to public health, and examining their genetic makeup. That doesn't mean that they were trying to make it worse or that they wanted this to get out in some way. But the possibility exists. These laboratories, they're called biosafety level 4 laboratories, and there are a dozen or more in the United States, as well as in other countries, other advanced countries. These laboratories have an imperfect record of security and safety. And so the possibility exists that leaks can occur. No one has yet produced conclusive evidence that that happened in this case. And the microbiologists who have studied the genetic makeup of this particular virus, by the majority of them say that it has a natural, it can be explained as a natural origin, a naturally developing virus that came from animals.
Yeah, yeah.
So the issue has not been settled completely. Bioweapons are, not really the most likely source, but the possibility exists that it could have been a lab leak in Wuhan, which got into the population there. Even Fauci said 2 days ago that he thinks it was spreading in Wuhan more before it showed up before the first cases arose at the animal market that most people have publicly attributed the virus to.
Mm. Dave, there has to be a significant political cost to how this crisis is dealt with. If you go back to New Orleans and the flooding and the FEMA's handling of things then, and Bush remained president, but the criticism was substantial. And if you've got bodies stacking up like cardboard, and Nancy, I wanted you to come onto this question as well about back in 1918. I know you said there wasn't much demand in terms of the expectation of federal government, but perhaps there was locally in terms of mayors. Dave, there has to be a significant backlash if government is seen to have mishandled this, failed to provide supplies, failed to communicate properly, failed to provide lockdowns or implement lockdowns early enough if there are significant death tolls.
Yeah, anecdotally, we're hearing information that there's been significant dissatisfaction, people's expectations with regard to the president. The degree to which the administration is trying to manage the message over the last several weeks is the degree to which, I think, if you just look at what they've done to manage the message, is the degree to which politically they've been threatened. Remember, during Katrina, even though there was this incredible disappointment and sadness with regard to the magnitude of that tragedy and the failure of the federal government, there was a counter narrative that a lot of what happened at Katrina was really New Orleans' fault, and making blaming the victims became a sub-message that was also put out there to minimize the impact. There has to be an impact on perception. We just have to wait a little bit of time to see really what it is.
Got it. So too early to say. Nancy.
Yeah, and in 1918, what's interesting is it's counterintuitive to us today, but the greatest political fallout was actually pushback against the restrictions. When in many communities, an additional wave of influenza came through in December and January, many cities had reopened, were back in business in a sense, and when a renewed wave came in, it was very difficult for political leadership to impose any kind of public health restrictions. And the political hostility was not about all of those deaths. The political fallout was much more about business leaders being frustrated and consumers being angry about not having access to those, going out for their meals, as you suggested, going to the dance halls, going to the saloons.
Dave, I've got a question here about the rural economy. I mean, farmers around here are continuing to work. The big issue is getting people to pick crops or plant crops and having enough manpower to do it.
Right. The Iowa economy is not labor dependent. Subsets of it are the confined animal operations, poultry production, more labor dependent. But most of Iowa's ag economy is mechanically and chemically dependent, and it really doesn't need a lot of people to farm one heck of a lot of land. That's significantly different, though, than what's going on in California, other kinds of states that produce more of the kinds of foods that you and I eat every day, like vegetables, like fruits, like salads, those types of things. They are labor dependent. How this is going to affect that economy, many of whom first are undocumented. They're not going to qualify for any federal aid, and this, the relative safeguards that they're able to implement and or enjoy in their workplace are things that we're going to have to just wait and watch and see. But the expectation is that we're going to be seeing labor shortages out in those producing areas in the next few months.
Yeah. Jeff, coming back to you, and we've got to wrap up after this. The president has to be praised for the economic, this along with Congress, for the size of the intervention here. It is colossal. But what else do you think he should be doing at this time? What else should the president be doing?
So there's already discussion. Your listeners may be aware of an additional aid bill. And when you compare with what the United States has done to what some neighboring countries have done, for example, Canada, it's clear that we haven't matched what other governments have done to try to restore lost income or to ensure that people are not let go, or to aid businesses that are trying to keep people on. And I think that what's going to happen is that people are going to see at the end of April that the hospitals are overwhelmed. The number of deaths is shocking. Even though we've been warned, it'll seem shocking then, and that the consequence will be pressure will build again for additional economic assistance, not only to small businesses, but to people who've been laid off or fired from their jobs because of the shutdown in economic activity. It's clear that it's uncertain right now how much the government can do to prevent this huge wave of deaths from occurring. I don't know what your other speakers said about this before I came on, but at this point, the government is mostly going to be called on to ameliorate the consequences of a disastrous set of events rather than to prevent the disaster from occurring.
Yeah, and it's essentially down to the states to take the action now.
Yeah.
Well, listen, there we have to leave it. I want to thank Nancy Bristow, Jeffrey Smith, and David Swenson very much for their participation. It's been fascinating. We will be scheduling another talk next week and sending you emails out about that. And again, do send us any suggestions about things that you would like to discuss. We'll be covering places like Russia, Hungary, the Middle East, and we'll have a whole panel of experts in each place. So thank you again to our speakers, and thanks again for joining us, and we'll be back online soon. Thank you and goodbye.